Okay, so this is the profiling of the not-for-profit sector that we do every year. So many of you will have seen this before, although we've got a little new addition in the end where we've done a few case studies, so not entirely a repeat of previous years. So this is a longitudinal analysis starting in 2017. Well, we've been doing it longer than that, but we're looking at the last 5 years. In this one, we're exploring both profitability and growth in revenue overall for a group of not-for-profit sector clients. This is based on year-end results submitted to the Charity Commission, and it's 117 charities delivering adult social care. So we've categorised them as far as possible by main client group, although there is a bit of overlap, and also we've looked at a group of small providers as well. And together these organisations have a combined turnover of more than 3.3 million in 2021. And that's a quick breakdown of what those sizes look like. So it's a fairly even spread actually. So these are the boundaries. So we've got profit, the struggling is we've got less than 1% profit, doing okay 1 to 3%, outperforming more than 3% profit. Growth in revenue, we've got those that are shrinking, they're growing by less than inflation in that year, doing okay, inflation to 5%, growing rapidly more than 5%. So those are the boundaries that we're working with and how we've categorised them. So the big messages for the cohort overall, there have been improvements in both growth and profitability between 2020 and 2021, quite significant improvements in some cases. The slight outliers here are providers for services for older people and people with autism, which we'll come on to talk about. There's a slight change in this year's trends overall in that the sector's profitability has been performing much more strongly than its growth. And we think this strong performance can in part be explained by a range of factors, one being the organisations receiving COVID grants and monies, not all of which will have been spent in year, a reduction in spending on kind of big infrastructure projects or similar during the pandemic, and also a reduction in delivery of some non-core activities that would have been restricted due to COVID restrictions, lockdown, etc. Also, we thought there might be less use of agency staff when staff moving around between organisations wouldn't have been ideal. So looking at all growth across the organisations, you can see that there is a bit of an uptick there between 2020 and 2021, up to 41% in that growing rapidly section. But actually, really, this is kind of returning to 2019 levels, so it's not a huge kind of pandemic-induced increase. Whereas all profitability, we see a really big leap in that outperforming group in 2021 after a kind of relatively steady state at around 30% of those in the outperforming, 50-ish% in the struggling. And so a really marked change there in 2021. And this maps both growth and profitability. So we've got up there in the dark green is the kind of high profit and high growth, and then we've got low profit and low growth right at the bottom. And again, you can see because of that big increase in profit, there's a big increase in those that are in that top, those green areas, the high profit, high growth, high profit, medium growth sections. And this is just the very top performing, so the very best performing, that high profit, high growth, low profit, low growth. And yeah, you can see it's been relatively steady and then a big increase in the best performing group. And yeah, the first year where that best performing has outweighed the worst performing. And so autism providers are a slight outlier in that their growth has reduced slightly, but their profitability had a significant increase in 2021 after quite a kind of relatively volatile last 5 years, and a big collapse in 2020. And we think this might be due to a range of things. So again, like other providers during the pandemic, we think autism providers probably received some COVID funds and might have had to reduce activity in a similar way. But we thought autism providers were probably particularly unable to fill vacancies during the pandemic, and also there's a kind of a longer term trend of the autism market becoming more competitive with an increasing number of private providers who are giving an offer for autism, who might be offering cheaper places. So the not-for-profit sector is kind of being a bit squeezed in that way. So we think that might be part of the reason for that trend. So this is all growth again. And you can see that autism providers are the only group where growth has slowed slightly. Although again, it's not a huge shift because it's kind of returning to those 2019 levels. But profitability, that's all profitability again, and their profitability has jumped quite significantly since a really big decrease in 2020. But again, actually, we're only really catching up on 2019 levels. So the real outlier there was 2020, where we don't really know what happened. But there was a big collapse, and so now they're nearly in line with the cohort as a whole in 2021. This is the snapshot mapping the profitability along the bottom, growth on the top. So again, we've got those that are struggling and shrinking there, and those that are outperforming and growing rapidly in the top. So in 2017, we had 29% in that top right-hand corner, 36% down here, and now it's a real shift because of that increase in profitability. So we've got 60% up there in the positive corner. So older people providers are kind of some of the real outliers, and there's been a small reduction in growth between 2020 and 21, but profitability has fallen across the last 4 years, and it makes it kind of quite out of line with the rest of the cohort, and they are the only group where the lowest performing group outweighs the highest performing group when profitability and growth are mapped against each other. But we think these trends are to be expected, really, given the significant challenges faced by the sector during the pandemic. Obviously weren't taking on new clients often due to the rates of infection, and obviously a lot of clients very sadly passed away. But we think it also might reflect a longer term move away from local authorities placing older people in residential care as kind of a long-term option at the end of their life. There's been that kind of shift towards using residential care more as a step down or step up option out of hospital, which not all not-for-profit existing older people providers are equipped for at this stage. They're kind of more in that traditional residential care field at the moment. And there was a while where that kind of gap in beds was being filled by central government funds, and that's tailing off. So we don't think this is entirely pandemic-induced trend. This is all growth again, and then you can see older providers is a little bit lower. Not terrible, but a bit of a drop off from 2020 after we had seen some improvements since 2017, and an increase in the proportion that was shrinking. All profitability, and then we've quite a significant difference with the profitability of older people providers compared to the cohort as a whole. So we're down to 28% that are outperforming and a massive 60% that are struggling. And it does seem like the pandemic's kind of given that a kick, but as you can see, it is a pattern of slightly longer term reductions there in profitability as well. So the snapshot again in 2017, 27% up in that corner, 54% in the struggling corner. Actually, this hasn't changed so much because 2017 was actually a particularly bad year. So actually, it's slightly better in that top corner in 2021. Learning disability providers have done one of the cohorts that have done best in terms of their profitability and growth. And a big increase in that highest performing group and reduction in the weakest. That's all growth again, compared to 48% of those growing rapidly in 2021 for learning disability providers, and a big increase on 2020. And huge number of providers, a huge percentage of providers that are outperforming in the learning disability sector, and huge increase on 2020, and higher than the cohort as a whole. So there's the snapshot again. We've got 35% in that positive corner, 43% in that less positive corner in 2017, and that's shifted. So we've got 52% in that positive corner in 2021. Mental health, substance misuse, and homelessness providers. Growth has stayed relatively similar. I think there's been a little shift in the shrinking group, and steady improvements in profitability since 2018. There's all growth again. And relatively similar to last year in terms of growth for this cohort, although a little reduction actually in those that are shrinking, more that are just doing okay. And again, a big increase in their profitability and bigger than the cohort as a whole, although that has been a relatively steady trend actually since 2018. The proportion of those outperforming has been increasing kind of year on year. So 2017, only 16% up in that positive corner, 46% down here, and then a big change, so 45% up there, 24% in the struggling area. So finally then, small providers. Small providers have improved both their growth and profitability performance again, in line with the cohort as a whole since some small declines in 2020, and yeah, an improvement in that high performing group. And so that's all growth. Again, there's a big group a big increase in that growing rapidly section. Fewer people just doing okay. That's probably where the big move has been, shifting from doing okay into the growing rapidly. And then, yeah, again, a big increase, although really it's not such a big increase in profitability from 2019. There was again a big drop off in 2020. So yeah, there's 2017, and I think this was one of the slight outliers because the snapshot that we had from the 2017 presentation gave quite a positive picture here, and I think slightly more positive than this year, and we think that could be because we've done some boundary changes since, and we've also added some missing data we've backdated some missing data this year, so we think that might be the reason for that kind of slight disparity there. So this is the summary of the overall performance. So you can see that really it's a positive picture with those outperforming or growing rapidly, outbalancing those that are stagnating or shrinking, apart from for that older people group that's going the other way. So overall, you know, most people are kind of in that green zone. Conclusions then, I suppose, so while this kind of looks like quite a positive picture overall, we don't really know what the true state of affairs is, and some of this is quite an artificial picture kind of created by that COVID money, and you know, we don't know what the true state of affairs is now, and it's likely that we might see a decline in some of these trends in the next year. So it'll be interesting to see when we come around to do this again what the changes have been. That said, you know, many organisations are clearly coming out of the pandemic with stronger balance sheets, and that will last. You know, that puts you in a strong position going forward. And the issue is more whether that kind of revenue, that growth, holds up in the same way. And really, in a time of high inflation, it's the kind of revenue that we want to be seeing, because that cash is not so important as it depletes so quickly. So providers are going to need to kind of focus on building up their client base again after the pandemic, and you know, making sure building up that revenue. And so now we've looked at a few case studies of individual organisations and how those have changed over a 10-year period, because I think we're conscious when putting this together that actually the story for individual providers might be quite different to the cohort as a whole, even of the cohort of your kind of individual sector as a whole. And growth and profitability can be fairly volatile over a 10-year period, particularly for smaller providers. Although not exclusively, as you'll see, there's some large providers which see big changes as well. So we've picked out 14 case study organisations to illustrate how these trends can vary for individual organisations, both by profitability and by growth. So yeah, we've looked from a 10 or 11-year period actually. This graph showing up to 50% growth and minus 50%. These are just 4 that we picked out that were kind of particularly volatile. So first, we've got a large disabilities and autism provider. You can see some big variation there, up to kind of 20% growth and a low of -5 in 2017. There's a large older people provider, again kind of huge changes. We've got up to 40% growth in 2012, down to nearly -10 in 2015, and yeah, some tailing off to the end of 2021 as well. This is a small mental health provider who's had some real changes in fortunes over the years, up to nearly 50% growth in 2017, followed right in 2018 by -40, so I don't know what was happening there, but yeah, very volatile. And a small learning disability provider that's got quite a nice pattern of up and down year on year, or kind of every 2 years. I think this then maps them against the rest of the 14. So you can see some of the others are less volatile, but we're still seeing a lot of up and down, and And I think what was interesting is that those peaks and troughs are not happening at the same time for different organisations. It feels very random when those are happening. And it is probably the smaller ones where you see the real changes, but there are some larger ones that are seeing those changes as well. Profitability. So these are the 4 that were kind of some of the most volatile here. We've got a small learning disability provider, kind of sloping some changes from, actually recovering, so 2021 getting finally back to where it was in 2010 with a kind of 15%, 20% growth. Small mental health provider, I think this is the same one as the pink, some big changes there. A small learning disabilities provider, and then a large older people provider swooping right up from minus 30% up to more positive growth from kind of 2017, 2018 onwards. And then that's the cohort as a whole. To be honest, there were more organisations that were doing a more sort of gentle undulation, I would say, in the profit than in the growth. There was more variation in the growth, but still some really big changes going on over that 10-year period. And then we thought we would map 2 organisations that are kind of in one who started off in 2010 at either side of that performance spectrum. So one, that A here, that says large autism provider, that's stagnating, that was in 2010 was stagnating, shrinking in terms of growth, and was struggling in terms of profit. B is a small mental health provider that in 2010 was growing rapidly and outperforming in terms of its profit. So we're just going to track these 2 over a 10-year period. So 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, zooming right up there again, 2020, 2021, they finish up around there. So that's just a little indicator of just two probably the most volatile, to be fair, but those graphs show that this isn't a completely atypical experience, given kind of how those, how small really those boundaries are that we were using, like 5%, 3% here and there. People were moving like 10, 20, 30, 40%. So yeah, I think the conclusions there really are that the fortunes of individual organisations can vary massively over a 10-year period and can look quite different from the cohort as a whole. And this volatility is expected in the voluntary sector, particularly for smaller organisations. You're trying to do the very best for your client but remain profitable at the same time. It's a hard thing to do. So I suppose the overall message is if your growth and profitability doesn't necessarily match the overall picture we presented, this isn't necessarily a reason to worry. And yeah, it's a very volatile and varied picture.